We are going to talk to Adam, he, him in England, who wants to talk about the contingency argument. Adam, you're on the air with Jimmy and Richard.
Hi, Jimmy and Richard.
Hey.
Hello, Adam. I've been looking forward to this.
Like I said before, okay, cool, yeah. Like I said before, I'm a Catholic, and I think that the contingency argument by Thomas Aquinas is valid and sound, and it establishes the existence of an eternal, omnipotent ground of reality. And there's a number of such arguments, but I like the one by Aquinas the most.
Can I start off by asking you why particularly Aquinas? Because in philosophy, that's kind of a bit an outdated one.
Just because of the way that it proceeds. So it starts off by describing the fact that we observe contingency as a relationship between things. Then there's a reductio ad absurdum in there, which allows us to infer that there exists some non-contingent entity. And then he establishes the relationship that has to eternity, and establishes that concludes basically that such a thing is comports with the existence of a God.
Okay, so in there is the allowance for the possibility of a universe that has no beginning and time in Aquinas' argument. So first of all, how do you kind of get around that one?
I would say that
Sorry, I thought you'd gone.
The allowance of a universe which has no beginning in time, because obviously they didn't have the concept of the Big Bang back in those days. That's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah, and the argument allows for that. So how would you kind of make your way around that one and get to God from that?
I would say that the universe doesn't fit the definition of God, and I would say that the argument has a scope which encompasses the universe itself, but is not limited to the universe. So the universe would, on my interpretation, would be a contingent entity because it's contingent on certain abstract.
But if the universe is not beginning in time, it's not contingent. A contingent thing is something that is contingent on something else for its existence. So if it allows for a possibility for a universe that has no beginning, then that universe is definitionally not contingent.
Yeah, but we know that the universe did have a beginning in time.
It's irrelevant what we know. We're talking about Aquinas' argument. You know, as I've said, Aquinas' argument is considered like pretty outdated in philosophy now, but that's what we're talking about. That's what you find compelling. So that's the one we're talking about, and it does allow for the possibility of a universe that has no beginning. So how do you get around that difficulty within Aquinas' argument? It doesn't matter what we know now.
Well, I'd say that the argument doesn't make the hypothesis that the universe is eternal. So as long as it doesn't make such a hypothesis, we're not tied into the interpretation that is the universe that's eternal.
That doesn't avoid the difficulty of it could be. It allows for it to be. And that's the objection I'm raising to you. Aquinas' argument allows that the universe could have no beginning. So how do you get over that objection?
Well, the point of the argument is that it has a wide scope, right? So all it's seeking to establish is that something is eternal. That the something that is eternal doesn't have to be the universe.
No, it doesn't have to be the universe. But I'm asking you how you get around the objection that it could be the universe.
Right. So, but if someone says that it could be the universe, we just know that to be false. The argument still holds because the point of the argument is
no, we don't know it to be false because we're talking about Aquinas' argument. We're not talking about a modern argument which proposes that the universe began. We're talking about Aquinas' argument, which, as you said, has a wide scope. It may not be the universe, but it is possible to be the universe. So how do you get over that objection? Because all I'm hearing at the moment, with respect, is, well, I don't think it's the universe. But how do you get over that as an objection that it could be the universe?
Right, but so the point of the argument is that there's like something is eternal. So if you respond by saying it could be the universe, well, the conclusion of the argument isn't committed into that conclusion.
I agree. That's why I'm asking you what you would say as to that as an objection to it, because it could be the universe. We agree that it could be the universe, it seemingly, but how where are you stepping out of it could be the universe, that it's not the universe, it's something else?
Well, this is something that's not determined by the argument, whether or not it's the argument.
I know it's not determined. That's the argument. That's why I'm asking you kind of how you would deal with that objection to it. It's a wide scope. It allows for many things that could be eternal. What is your, if you're using this argument as something that you find compelling, how do you say definitively that it's not the universe? It's a legitimate objection to the argument.
I wouldn't say that it's an objection to the argument, because the argument doesn't try to prove that it's the physical universe that is non-contingent or eternal. That's not a claim of the argument. The claim is that something is eternal, yeah?
Right. Something is eternal. The universe could be that thing. You personally, not the argument, but you personally, how would you get over that it could be the universe? Because to say, I'm quite happy to sit here and say Aquinas' argument is fine. There's no problem with it. There could be something that's eternal. That we could agree on that. That would be the end of the call. It'd be a very boring call, and it wouldn't get us any closer to God.
Well, if you're admitting that something is eternal, then that establishes that at least one thing has a property that God has. So I'd say it does get us closer. But so now you're asking me what would my It
doesn't matter if we get it closer. We're making a deductive argument for God, aren't we? It doesn't matter if we're getting closer. It matters if the God is the conclusion. So how do you get over the objection of this eternality? Jimmy, jump in, please.
Yeah, well, if God is the conclusion, then how are we ascribing a property to it? Like, how are we saying, well, we know that something's eternal and we know that God is eternal, therefore the thing that's eternal must be God, but we haven't established that God is there. And we need to first land on God as a conclusion before we can start ascribing properties to it. It's the same thing as if we were to say, well, God's a nice guy or God's not so nice. God's eternal or God's not eternal. We need to conclude first before we move forward. And so I think what you're saying, and please forgive me if I'm wrong, I think you're positing Aquinas' argument, which is stating that the universe could be eternal, but then over time, right, we have determined that the universe essentially or theoretically began, okay? So it's not eternal, right? So if it's not the universe, therefore God. That's what I think you're trying to say. So I'd like you to respond to that, but then, yeah, pick back up with what Richard had to say.
Okay, so I'll respond to Jimmy first. So the argument doesn't try to conclude that it is that it's God. That God is not the conclusion of the argument. The argument is just that something is eternal, and I also interpret it to mean that something is also omnipotent. Because by dint of what the contingency relationship is.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, you just threw that in there.
Why has omnipotence suddenly jumped into it?
That's a new conclusion.
Okay, so if everything is contingent on some necessary entity, well then the other side of that relationship is that the necessary entity has the power to actualize all of those those contingent entities, right? Because they have a conditional dependency.
They have a conditional dependency on that thing, but that doesn't make it omnipotent, doesn't make it all powerful. It means it is sufficient for that particular thing, which is contingency. That says nothing about anything else related to any other kind of power. It's simply that it has the power it is sufficient for that contingency of those things, contingent things. That is it. Omnipotent is just plucking something out your arse for that one. Where's that come from? Where in the argument is that suggested in any way whatsoever, outside of wishful thinking and special pleading?
Right, so it's
and I'm sorry. Instead of in response to what I said, instead of not ascribing a property, you then ascribed a new one. So you didn't even take a step back. You took a step in a different direction and changed the conversation completely by adding that not only is this thing eternal, but it's also all powerful. So I just want to point that out.
Okay, so just putting things in simple terms, right? So if y is contingent on x, then this means that x is sufficient to actualize y, right? So x provides the condition by which y becomes actual. Well, that means that x has power over y. So if
yes, but it doesn't mean it's all powerful. It means it's sufficient for that particular thing. And this particular thing we're talking about is contingency. So that thing is sufficient for contingency. Stating all powerful is adding so many more layers onto that.
And is
my parents are sufficient for contingency with myself.
Is X being powerful over Y? Is that an accurate description, or does it just mean that X is required for Y? By what definition or what way are you using power? That X has power over Y.
Right. So if you say Y is a contingent entity, whereby its existence is contingent on X, well, that means that X provides the sufficient cause for Y. That's bringing that thing into actuality. That would be
but describing that as having power over it is a much different characterization than just saying it needs to be there as the foundation for Y to take place.
I'm happy, Jimmy, with Adam's explanation of it being sufficient and having power over it for that sufficiency. It's where the all power comes into it, the all spark. It's where the all power comes. I don't know why I said that. Sorry. It's where the all power comes into it, where I'm really, really, really struggling with this. So now on this front, on this question, we've got two major things that I'm struggling with. One is how you get over that this eternal thing might just be the universe, because you seem to be having to add something else on top of it to get to that. And the second one is how we've jumped from this thing being sufficient to start these contingent things to being all powerful, which is it just seems to have been plucked out of nowhere. So these are the two major problems I've got with this argument you're making. I'll let Jimmy just have a quick word, and then I'll leave you to respond, Adam.
No, I think I want to hear this conversation between you two continue, please.
Okay, so Richard, so if you're agreeing that if Y is contingent on X, then X can sufficiently actualize Y, and that's an example of power. That's a way of describing power. Well, if every contingent entity, every contingent effect in existence ultimately terminates in the necessary entity, the non-contingent entity, well, that means that the non-contingent entity has power over all effects. So that would be all the power.
No, it doesn't. Why does it? Why does it mean that?
It can bring all effects. Okay, so if something can bring all effects, it can bring all effects into actuality, then that thing has power over all effects, right? It has the power to bring any effect into existence, right?
No, not necessarily. It has the power, because the thing is, here's what we're saying here. Something is contingent. Now, contingent things can be contingent on other contingent things. I'm assuming we agree on that. So what we're saying is we've got this one necessary thing which has started this chain of contingent things. Now, that doesn't mean that this one contingent thing has the power to start over something, 1,000 contingent things down the line. And we see this with the universe itself. If we do take the Big Bang Theory into account, the universe began from a singularity. Now, at that point, the universe was infinitely dense and infinitely hot. And out of that came atoms. You wouldn't get a jump from the singularity forming the universe as we had it now. That would not be a possible thing. So just because it has power over the first contingent thing, it does not give it power over all contingent things that follow. We can actually demonstrate that with the universe we have. So how are you saying this thing is all powerful? It seems to me like you are special pleading it to be all powerful because that is one of the qualities you want to give God. And that's why you're throwing it in there, but you're not demonstrating it.
Okay, let me explain how.
And I know that I know that I am hung up. I'm sorry, and Richard, I know that you're okay with the word power being implemented there, but I fail to see how that is an adequate characterization, because by putting the word power in there, that is how you're allowing yourself to jump to this term of all powerful and omnipotence. But let's change that, okay? You have, so far in this conversation, you and Richard have used the word sufficient. Could we say that the very first thing was all sufficient? No, I mean, we could say that, but that doesn't give your argument any validity, because what you're aiming for is the all-powerful argument. But if we change that word, then you lose that omnipotence. And so I can see why you would want to hang your hat on this concept of power. For me, I just fail to see why that is something that is a good way of explaining something. Like my parents, right, I am contingent. My existence is contingent on them being together. That doesn't mean they have power over me, but their status as being living beings is sufficient. It's sufficient to create the conditions to where I am then created, if you will, or born, right? But that doesn't mean they have power over me. And that I'm just hung up on that because it speaks to this idea of the special pleading and of this characteristic you're trying to provide without really landing at the conclusion you need to first. So I'm hung up there. I'm not past that, but I'll allow you to continue. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll respond to Richard's point that some arbitrary point down the contingency series, if you select some given term of the series, then that is only contingent on what immediately came before it and not ultimately the beginning of the series. So I think that's the essence of your point there, where the beginning, you were calling the beginning of the series the series.
No, I'm going to stop you there because I think you're trying to kind of twist things a little bit there. I didn't say that it wasn't ultimately dependent on the thing at the start of the series. What I said was that the start of the series does not have power over all those things in that line. They are contingent upon it ultimately, but that does not give it power over every step in the series. We can see this in the universe we live in. We know this is the case for the one example we have of something that may be a necessary thing, a necessary being, which has caused contingent things. The one example that could, and I'm not saying it is the case because we don't know, but the one example that we have that is the best example that we have of possibly being the case, we know that this is the case. So I'm not saying that it doesn't ultimately rely on it, which is what you said I was saying. That's a straw man. What I'm saying is it does not have power over every single thing in the line. It is not all powerful.
Okay, let me respond to that formulation then. So in this universe, where every single event is contingent on the laws of physics, and the laws of physics have existed since the expansion of the singularity. So that would be an example, that would be a counterexample to what you're saying, Like the fact that
no, it wouldn't.
Is still
no, it wouldn't, because
over every subsequent event.
Because the laws of physics, as we know them, weren't present at that initial time. Everything that came from that, all we have with the singularity is a point that was infinitely hot and infinitely dense. As far as we know, the laws of physics might not have even existed at that time. We don't know. All that we know is that for some unknown reason, this thing began to expand. And then everything began to cool down, and everything began to settle into what we now call the laws of physics, into where the laws of logic that we have apply. We do not know that those things applied in that singularity. We simply do not know that.
So what I mean is that the laws of physics have existed since the point of expansion. The expansion itself depends on the laws of physics, right?
All right, so I'm going to jump in here for a second. Forgive me, Richard. So we're at 21 minutes right now in this call, and we did invite you to call back, but I'm not sure that we're getting anywhere. So I am going to step out, and I am going to let Richard dictate the rest of this call. But I think what we're going to do is probably get wrapped up here. So I'd like you to kind of just summarize and conclude with the questions that Richard's asking you. Try in your best, your best way. Try and answer those questions. So go ahead. I'm going to kick it over to Richard.
Yeah, Adam, please summarize and conclude, and then I'll kind of say something to finish.
All right. So, as far as I understand, the two of the objections that you asked me, I'll try and summarize my answer to them. Is that the universe could be the eternal necessary entity, and that we know that the initial event doesn't necessarily have power over any given event that's currently taking place in the universe. What I would say is that viewing things as a bunch of contingency relationships between the singularity and the universe and the laws of physics, this is essentially my view. So I would say that the singularity, as far as we define it, would end up being defined in the same way as God. So the singularity is, spaceless, it's eternal, and so on. But I would just say that the singularity, if we see it that way, is omnipotent over everything that takes place in the universe, because every event that takes place in the universe is contingent on the laws of physics, and the laws of physics are themselves contingent, and we know that they're contained by the singularity. And I would just say the singularity is just another word for God. And I would say that obviously you were asking me at the beginning, what would you say to the objection that the universe might be necessary? Well, I'd say the universe is not eternal, but the singularity is. And so what the necessary entity that the Aquinas' argument refers to is ultimately the singularity.
Okay, right. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate that. I would ask that you kind of go away, have maybe formulate those two objections you've just brought into an argument, and give us a call back. I'm going to let you go. I appreciate the call. The problem, as I said from the beginning, I've got here is that in Aquinas' argument, there's nothing that states it's nothing like the Big Bang Theory. It's nothing like the singularity. So what Adam's done is he's jumped from his, this idea of Aquinas' argument, which is just allows for eternity, to this singularity thing. That's a problem for me, because he's jumping from one thing to another. Another problem for me with what he's just said is that he's equating the singularity with God.
Yes. And I'm glad you said that. You know why? Because in the beginning of the call, Adam said, well, the point of this argument is not to conclude God. And then the very, very last thing he said was, I'm calling that singularity God. Well, I mean, you have just concluded essentially that God is the singularity that you really didn't mention in your whole argument. And then that's what you throw in to clean it all up. I mean, you haven't provided any proof for God, and you got to do that before you start giving God characteristics. I always say that, and that's kind of a line I draw. So interesting discussion. I would love to hear back from Adam. I'm so thrilled that he called back.